So yeah, although the talk says, the description says PHP 8.3, that is a difficult thing to do because PHP gets improvements all the time. And I thought it's always useful to learn about the really new things. But that's often required to be tied in with slightly older versions. So what I'm talking about is PHP 8.1 to 8.4. And you might have realized 8.4 isn't out yet. So some of the things might come with some caveats because they might end up changing before it actually gets into the release later this year. So hi, I'm Derick. Hi, Ines. Hi, thanks. Oh, the buttons go the wrong way around, I don't know. So hi, I'm European, living in London. We can talk about that over a few beers. Well, I find that important to put on my slide. I used to be the PHP 7.4 release manager. That basically means herding people to make sure that they don't commit things too late. I do some work for the PHP Foundation. I did Xpubic. I like maps, beer, and whiskey. Irrelevant to the talk, but maybe interesting for later. And you can find me on Mastodon. I don't do Twitter anymore. I refuse to call it X. Without further ado, let's dive straight in. There will be quite a lot of code on the slides. Hopefully you won't fall asleep, but then there's lots of coffee here, so that's a good thing too. So sometimes I can't remember in which PHP versions things get introduced, and most of the time I have that on my slide, but I forgot for that one. For this one, we got at some point the read-only keyword, right? Before we got the read-only keyword, how would you define read-only ability? That is a really difficult word, by the way. You'd have to make like a private property, and then you need to use a getter. Now, this becomes important later in the presentation, why we don't do things like this anymore. But to continue about read-only ability, or readability, it does actually do quite a bit more. In PHP 8.1, we got this actual read-only keyword. And the read-only keyword makes sure that you can write to a property only once. So read-only is a bit of a weird name. It should really be called write once, but that's also awkward because it's supposed to be read-only. So we call it read-only after all. So read-only properties, they can only be initialized once. Usually you do that in your constructor or your factory methods, and only in the scope where it was declared. So you can't do it from another function. So they're also sort of private-ish as well. And then in A2, we got the actual read-only keyword on classes, which basically marks all your properties as read-only properties. But it also does a few other things. For example, it prevents dynamic properties from being created. A dynamic property is if you do in a function or anything like that, or a method, you do this equals property name I have never used before equals value, then PHP will create that as a new property in your class, so in your object, I should say. That's called a dynamic property. If your whole class is marked as read-only, you can't do that, and you'll get an error message. The read-only keywords can also only be used on typed and non-static properties. That's the way how read-only worked on normal properties as well. You can only use them. But that also means that all your properties in your class now have to be typed and non-static for read-only to be able to use on your objects and your classes. Also, inherited classes must also be read-only. Now, we had an argument about that at some point. There was a proposal to do a few things extra read-only, but I'll get back to that in a second. Because in PHP 8.3, we added a few things to read-only. So the first thing that was proposed, that inherited classes don't have to be read-only anymore. You don't see that on the slide because that is a proposal that didn't end up passing. But what did end up passing is the ability that if you're in a clone method, that you can override your read-only properties again. Which is kind of nice, and it sort of makes sense. We did originally discuss that to do that with a read-only keyword in PHP 8.2 directly, but we had to figure out some details, and sometimes technical details take longer than you have time before a release gets made. Okay, I just said that. Now, with the read-only keyword in PHP 8.2 on classes, it already said that it would also not allow you to then create dynamic properties anymore. But similarly in PHP 8.2, we also stopped, we started showing deprecation warning from using these dynamic properties. If you look at the voting record for this RFC, I was the only one voted against. But I disagree with that, with myself now there, because I started using phpday2, I ran some of my test classes, and then I found an error message because somebody had misspelled the word palette. So I had to make a fix for that. I know that's a bit small, but it's basically my spelling fix there. So in phpday2, you now get these warnings, and phpday3 and later, with the intention that dynamic properties are no longer allowed by default from PHP 9. When PHP 9 comes out, I can't tell you. It will be after PHP 8.4, but there might be an 8.5, an 8.6, 8.7. Unlikely, but possible. However, in some situations, you do still want to have those dynamic properties. It is sometimes useful. So there is a class attribute that allows you to then enable dynamic properties, or you can inherit from the std class, because by definition, that only does dynamic properties, because you can't define a standard class because it's already there. So there's some ways around it. I think this is actually now quite useful because it usually catches these weird spelling mistakes that I've just shown you on this slide here. Kind of useful. In PHP 8.2, we added enumerations like this. Enumerations is a whole topic that I don't really have the time to talk about, but there's some fun things in there. Like sometimes you want to create like a constant array where you do a mapping from prices. Now this is a contrived example. In this case we have this global constant prices and we want to do concurrency. We want to, I say concurrency, I mean currency. We want to link the price in euro to 19.99 and the price in pounds to pounds. In PHP 8.1 you get an error message for this, and in PHP 8.2 you also get an error message for this. So what has changed here now, right? What has changed that it is now possible to access the properties of enumeration values directly with the error method. So these are called fetch properties. Originally we thought we'd allow that on all objects with this syntax, but we decided not to do it in the end because we couldn't really think of a good reason why people wanted to use that. And that also the implementation details were so complicated and with so many edge cases that it wasn't really wise to do it either. But it is really useful for enumeration, so that's why we only allow it there now. I've never used this myself ever, to be fair. Another thing is that if you run the output of the script, ignoring the gray lines in there, what would you think that the answer of this is? What would you get as output? Someone want to shout it out? You don't have to be shy, I don't bite. You get an error message here, right? If you throw this out, if you run this. Why would you get an error message? Well, basically what you end up doing is you're creating a class, then you, by doing getPrivate method, which returns this and private method, that is sort of like an old style closure in PHP, which you then can call in this syntax. You can call, if you have an array with two elements, object and method, you can call that directly. But the funny thing is, of course, when you call this now, this no longer exists because we're no longer in the scope of tests, which means you can also not call a private method anymore on this object because it does no longer exist, right? And you'd be out of the scope for calling a private method. So you get an error message. Now for a long while we had this syntax, we had closure from callable this private method, which returns a closure over this calling private method, but it does bind this at that moment. So the return from this is already this callable, where this is bound to the scope where this getPrivate method was called from. So this is now a valid object, and then you can call it. However, this syntax is really annoying. So we now introduce in PHP 8.1 this ... operator to do a similar thing for that, which makes the syntax for this a whole lot easier to do. Now the ... operator is used many places in PHP. You can use it for the array, what do they call it? Array unpacking, that's the word. Unpacking, splatting is a term we have used. It is now also there for accepting multiple variables into a method or associative variables. All these things work as well. So the ... operator is used a lot. I'm not quite sure what the token name for this. It might actually be called tsplat or something funny like that. And that, of course, is a lot easier. Now, we allow that not only for methods, but basically for any other situation where you have the name of the function or method. And there's more of them, but they fell off the screen. But it basically works everywhere where you expect that to work. Now, in PHP 8.2, we did some more work on the type system. For a long time, we've always had the false type and the null type. But false could only be used as part of a union, only either string or false. And that is a pattern that you see in lots of PHP internal functions, like all the string finding functions. They either return a string or false and things like that. So when we added these types to PHP at some point, this is a pattern that we needed to support for PHP's internals. And because they were in PHP's internals, we also exported them to userland so that you could make use of that as well. Similarly, you couldn't use null or false. You could use null or bool for some arbitrary reason. Also, you couldn't use null standalone, which actually caused some issues. Like if you had a user finder, for example, which finds a user by email and it either returns the user or null if it can't find that. Now, if you want in your test cases to somehow always assert that it never returns a user, that it always returns null, in your inherited class and method, you could have then just type hinted with null. That wasn't allowed, and you had to leave the type hint away, which is kind of annoying to have to do. Also, the difference between void and null is sort of important as well. Void means the function doesn't return, and null means the function or method returns null. Slightly different. Now, PHP also didn't have a true type. We had false and null and bool, but not true, which is kind of weird. But it makes sense because PHP internally never needed it. And we didn't quite think of like, is this actually useful for people to use? We decided no. But then we changed our mind because it was now inconsistent with itself, and I know PHP is an old language, has many inconsistencies. That doesn't mean we like them, so we try to remove them as much as we can without breaking things. So in PHP 8.2 we now have like this as well. Similarly, for a long while we have had union types. They were introduced in PHP 8.0, where you could have int or float types. So if you have a number, you could do it as an integer or floating point number, which is kind of useful. And then in PHP 8.1, we got intersection types. Something has to be of both both interfaces here. So in this case, the countable iterator had to be traversable and countable at the same time. Now you can see where this is going. In PHP 8.2, we then introduced the last one, which is called disjunctive normal form types. That's a long word to pronounce, so we like to call that the DNF types instead, which is a combination of unions and it's a union of intersections, I should say. Basically, it allows you to type a parameter or an argument or a return type as it has to be either, in this case, an array, or it has to implement traversable and countable at the same time. I have used that for this specific use case, but I haven't used it personally for other use cases as well, although I've heard from other people they use this in all kinds of database modeling schemes as well. I have never seen an actual example yet. Now, we have unions, we have intersections, or pure intersections I should say, and we have DNF types. But what PHP does not have is an intersection of unions, which is the opposite of the union of intersections. But if you really think of it, you also don't need it, because every intersection of unions can be rewritten as a union of intersections. There's mathematical proof behind that, so trust me on that one. I'm not going to do maths here today. There's too much code already anyway. So we don't need it. So, and also, if we had to implement that, it makes the internal type resolving in PHP so complicated with potentially infinitive recursion in the types, which is something that you really don't want to do. Now there's one thing that is missing still. And the only thing that is missing, in my opinion, is that now because some of these compound type names get so long, you have to type them all the time. Now, how could we get around that, right? Well, we could implement something like user-defined types. You define a type as, say, typedef, this is a random word, typedef array thing, and then typedef that to array or traversable and countable. So and then you get to use this array type wherever you want. But this is the kind of tricky thing to do, because most of these things would have to be implemented as classes, and traditionally in PHP, classes are implemented in a single file. So a single file would have had that line so that the autoloader could pick that thing up, which is kind of an annoying way of having to do that. The alternative would be to have to define your type definition in each PHP file, which is also annoying because that means you can have different distinctions in different PHP files. But this is sort of how PHP internally works. PHP approaches compiling things file by file. So either the option is that you have to define it in each of the files where you use the type, or have a class that defines a type that then can be autoloaded. But then you get single line classes. So which one do we like? I don't know. We haven't come up with a proper plan to implementing that, so that's why it isn't in PHP yet. Because we'd like to prefer to do things well instead of hacky, like we did in the last 25 years. Or I should say the beginning 25 years. We are now at 27 years. PHP 8.2 introduced a random extension. It's a really random thing to talk about. Random numbers are actually remarkably complicated to do right. In the past, if you'd had to create a number between 0 and 100, how would you do that? Well, luckily rand supported a range, but all the way back in PHP, the random number generator basically just gave you a number, undefined what number, and then it was up to you how you divide it up in how many random numbers you needed. So if you needed 100, you could do modulo 100, and you get then a range from 0 to 100, or something like that. Again, math's not my strongest point. So for that, PHP already had interfaces, like they had rand, or the rand function. But sometimes you need to do more things with random numbers. Like if you want to shuffle an array, for example, then doing that in PHP was actually really hard to do it right correctly randomly. And the random extension that came in PHP 8.2 helps with us. Now, it has ridiculously complicated names. And the reason for that is that there's many ways of creating random numbers. The random numbers that PHP generates aren't actually random numbers. They are pseudo-random numbers. There's an algorithm that from a seed number, in this case 42, which I've commented out for a reason in a moment, from this seed number, it can then create pseudo-random numbers in a predictable order. Which is sounding slightly contrary, of course, because you expect random numbers, but the seed is important here. Now, PHP's random number generator before PHP 8.2 is an implementation of one, which was slightly different from most other languages, meaning that you couldn't create the same random sequence of numbers if you're in JavaScript or in PHP or in Perl, for example, which is sometimes something that you need to have. So PHP 8.2 implements a whole bunch of these generators. There's the one that PHP 8.1 and before use, which is what the default is. But there's also better ones that are then the same as other languages implement them. So that is good luck pronouncing this one, right? I can't do that. Shoshiro 256 ***. These names are more complicated than this. This is the easiest name in my opinion. So if you want to create a random number generator for a specific engine, you need to specify that. If you don't do that, like you don't do the engine line and you don't pass an engine to a random randomizer, then you get the behavior that PHP 8.1 and early did, which makes sense too. But it has a bunch of useful methods on it. They have like get bytes on it, which returns you 8 bytes of randomness. And it is proper random, not you doing it in such a way that it looks random. It is well done with the correct computer sciencey things behind the scenes, which are, again, maths. Don't want to go there. Similarly, you can do things like getInt, which gives you a number between 1 and 100. Or nextInt will give you a random integer. The next means the next in this series of random numbers that are being generated. But we also have interesting things like pick array keys. And pick array keys basically allows you to pick out, in this case, 2 array keys out of my fruit salad. Now, if you had to do that previously without the randomizer extension, how would you actually do that if you have associative keys? It isn't really simple to do, right? Because you could do array keys to get the array keys and then pick 2 out of that, but even picking 2 elements out of an array in a random way isn't that trivial to do. You can pick the first 2, but then you'd have to shuffle it first. So it's all slow ways of doing that. Whereas with the pick array keys, you just get 2 array keys randomly out of the array. Similarly, the shuffle array now also does things without you having to do complicated things. It's also very useful. And just to show you that this actually works, if I reload the slides, you get different numbers. Random numbers are fascinating in some way. However, we added a few more things in PHP 8.3 as well. We added a few more methods to it that are kind of useful. So there's the get bytes from string, which you can give all the letters you want a combination out of, and then how many you want out of that, which you can use for things like random domain names, which can be useful for all kinds of testing situations, right? Or you can use them for backup codes, like you do an implode of a string that only has the numbers in there. Or, what is probably more useful is that there's now a good method for doing floating point numbers as well. Doing randomized floating point number or arbitrary position numbers is actually a really hard thing to do correctly. So we have added that method now to PHP to do this correctly. And it also, as its third argument, has a boundary condition. Close means the number on the edges is included, whereas open means the number isn't included. So you can generate a number from -90 to +90, inclusive, or you can create one from what I've done here, from larger than -180 to 180 and including 180 and things like that. Is this useful to create random coordinates from the planet of Earth? I don't know. Maybe if you want to go on a holiday where you haven't been before, you can use this and figure out where you end up. I have no idea where this is. +51, +135. Going to guess somewhere in China, but put it on a map and find out. Right, PHP 8.2. We go back a little version, and we go to sensitive parameters. I'm wanting to highlight this because this is a feature that many people are not aware of. It is called a sensitive parameter attribute that you can set on arguments. Now, what this does is that if you tag an argument with this attribute and you throw an exception, usually what you get when you throw an exception is you get a stack trace with all the arguments, right? But if you are in a support forum with other administrators of software that you've installed, you want some help, you dump your stack trace. What else can be in this stack trace? Your Amazon tokens, your usernames and passwords and stuff like that, which isn't something that you want to have publicly available. Definitely not your AWS tokens, for example. So what PHP 8.2 allows you to do is you can now tag the attributes, or sorry, the arguments with this attribute, and then in your stack traces, you'll see that being replaced by object-sensitive parameter value, meaning that the value never leaks into your stack traces. So this triggers when you convert data to a string. If you have, so PHP also has the, what is it called again? Debug get print back trace. I can't remember the name of the function right now, which returns the stack trace, including all the arguments to the function that are being called. And in there, also you'll see that your sensitive parameter is now also wrapped with this object. You can still access the value by using the value property on this object. So this prevents leaking of sensitive data in log files and things like that. Now, this is an attribute you can use, but it's also one that BSP developers have also added to lots of places where we have passwords or usernames or DNS, DSN things to databases. All the places where we think that we have sensitive arguments. Now in Xdebug, if you have that loaded, you will not get it wrapped by an object because Xdebug doesn't expose anything stack trace-wise that you can attach a value of, so I don't have to wrap it in there. So you just get a string sensitive parameter. Again, only when you are creating a string out of this value. If you are in the debugger and you're debugging values, then of course you'll still get the original value because it's a debugger, you should be able to see the value. And if the whole world can debug your application while it's running, you have much bigger problems anyway. Because you can run basically anything on the machine. All right. Talking about attributes, we also get in PHP 8.3 a new attribute called override, which helps you catch mistakes in situations. Well, this is a fairly trivial example. Have anybody spotted the mistake yet? Yes, I've misspelled teardown, which means that if you run a PHP unit test like this, the teardown never gets called because it is just a random method and not an overloaded method, right? So what you can do is you can do this override argument on it or attribute, and then it will tell you that there was nothing that it could override. So the override attribute makes sure that the method that you're inheriting from a parent method is actually there, which is kind of useful. Similarly, beyond catching typos here, it is also useful that if, say, a library has an API where it has a method to do things and they refactor it in such a way where they remove this method, but you're still inheriting from it, you will now get an error because the original method no longer exists. Of course, you would only get this error when you actually have test cases, but that's a good thing. Now, there are a few caveats about having this, of course, because this only works if you have tagged all your functions with the attribute, right? So if you haven't done that yet, then of course you don't get the warning messages. We did actually look at not override as an attribute as well to do the opposite way, but that's really hard to do, and also you still have the problems like you have to basically revamp your library to allow for all of this. What is actually useful about the attributes that you can even set them on language version where the attributes aren't supported, because they look like a comment. It's kind of nice. We might get more attributes in the future built into PHP for all kinds of things. I have no example of them because we haven't come up with them yet. We also get fun things in A3 like typed class constants. Now, before PHP A3, this was totally valid. You can inherit a class constant from either an interface or in an inheriting class and have a totally different type. Which is kind of weird because that means in a method of class bar, your test constant is now null instead of an array or a string, which is what the interface expected you to have, right? I mean, this makes more sense if you have actually functions or methods on the foo class that expect it to be an array, and it is now no longer. So we have in PHP A3 added these type class constants, so if you type them, but only if you type them, then all the standard rules for inheriting types applies for the constant as well. So when you run this, you'll now get the fatal error, the type of foo test must be compatible with itest of type string. The funny thing is, the first time I made this slide, I didn't get the error, even though I was expecting the error. Like, that's odd. Did I have an older version of PHP where this wasn't implemented yet? No, it was the latest version. Turned out it was a bug. So sometimes writing a presentation actually finds bugs in PHP, which is great. Which brings me to the point that if there's a new version of PHP, we get release candidates and betas at some point, please test them with your applications, or especially your libraries, because you might end up finding things in PHP that we have done wrong, either because it's a bug, or we end up breaking something that we didn't intend. Like the PHP development team tries really hard not to break existing code. We get that wrong sometimes. We don't like to get that wrong sometimes. But without a lot of feedback, we don't necessarily know that we have done something. For most of the features that we think have breaking possibilities, we do actually look at the top 2,000 projects on GitHub, tagged with PHP, and are public, obviously have to be public, to do some side of effect testing, but we don't always get that right either. Right. PHP has lots of weird syntax that's grown into the language for 27 years. This is all the ways how you can do a dynamic fetch of a variable by using variables. How many of you have used one of these? Yeah. It is a bit of an old style, but you still see it all the time. What you see a bit more is dynamic properties. Like the variable bar contains the name of a property, right? Same thing you can for static properties or calling methods or static methods or classes of static methods. But what you couldn't do is class constants. The syntax in PHP didn't exist yet. And that was the only one missing. So you remember I was talking about making PHP consistent, right? This is one of these inconsistencies that we like to fix. So now in PHP 8, I should have put it on my slide because I forgot. Let's say A3, could be A2. We now have this new syntax as well where you can actually access that as a class constant name. So you can say the constant bar on the class foo that like I have in my first example. In the variable bar, I use bar as a string. And now by using foo, double colon, and then bar between parentheses, you end up substituting that for the name of the constant, which you then fetch. So that then returns bar. and maybe I should use different names for the constant name and the actual echo and actual output, because that would have made it slightly clearer. Interestingly, PHP also had this class constant on any class. And basically that is something that happens in PHP's compiler. If it sees that, it basically what it does, it replaces the fully qualified name of the class with a string version of its name. But it is something that happens in PHP's compiler. This isn't done while PHP is running at a later state where your code is running, rather when the files are being parsed. Henceforth, the class constant on a class, that's a lot of word class in a row, isn't actually a constant, it just looks like one. Which means that now we have dynamic class constants. We had to add a hack for that to make sure that this also works, which is kind of annoying. But like I said, we don't like inconsistency and we don't like breaking things. So that sometimes we get interesting design decisions, let's put it that way. Or we can call them hacks, if you must. Funny. More inconsistencies. PHP 8.2 and earlier. Oh, this is a feature that I've never ever used myself originally. In a function, you can have a static variable. And the static variable only gets initialized once. However, before PHP 8.2, you can do static I, or whatever value you had, multiple times. And the last one wins. But they're not run in order either. So you could have some other code that changes the value in between, and that wouldn't affect at all. Very odd. Also, you could only initialize your static variables with constant values. You couldn't use a method to return a value that you then assign. So all of these things got fixed in PHP 8.3. You can only do static I once. They are only called the first time you call this function, then it gets defined. And you can also call methods or functions in that to initialize the value. So in PHP 8.3, this will work much more like you would expect it to work. So in this case, when I call foo multiple times, so the first time we do echo begin, just before the foos, then the first time you call it, you'll see that bar gets called, and then the subsequent calls to foo, it wouldn't be called anymore because it was already initialized. Any of you ever use static variables like this? Yeah, I see a few people nodding. What reason? Lazy loading, I sometimes hear, but that wasn't really possible because you couldn't call functions. Refactoring old code, yes, I'm sure that happens there too. Yeah. A few other fun things in PHP 8.3, I'm keeping an eye out on the time here, is like we now have JSON validate. Sometimes the only way how you could validate JSON files in PHP was by calling JSON decode, but that builds up lots of data in memory. If you only had to validate the JSON file whether it was correct JSON to store it somewhere, like filtering input kind of thing, then you're not really interested in the structure itself. You only want to make sure that it's valid JSON. But there was no method for that in PHP. So 8.3 introduces the JSON validate function that does do the exact same parsing rules as JSON decode, but doesn't build up a structure in memory, which is a much faster way of doing it. But it is pointless if the next thing that you're doing is JSON decode, because you're basically parsing the same file twice. So it is only really useful if you're trying to validate a JSON file, not if you then also need to make use of the data that you're trying to decode from it. And with that, you also get the useful error message. Well, I say useful error messages out of it. They look something like this. Like if you call JSON validate on something that's broken, like this empty JSON file in my second example here, it's like you get false out of it is not valid JSON. You get a last error code and a syntax error. Like I said, you get error messages out of it, but are not particularly very useful because syntax error doesn't really tell you a lot either. Hopefully at some point we improve on the JSON decoder in PHP so that you can tell where in the string is actually your syntax error happening, and preferably also what syntax is being broken at some point. Not ideal, still better than having to decode it first yourself. Talking about parsing things. For a long time, PHP has had HTML parsing routines. Have any of you ever used like the HTML document bits of the XML extension? I see a few hands raising. It's really useful for parsing HTML4. How many of your websites are still in HTML4? Almost none, right? Most of you have probably switched to HTML5 because that's the de facto standard. But the parsing rules for HTML5 and 4 are different. So if you want to validate with the XML extension, want to validate a HTML document, you want to validate for HTML5 most of the time and not HTML4 because there's subtle changes in there which sometimes might break your validation routines in that case. Now, what are the options here? We can either change the validation in the HTML document class to use HTML5, but that will break people's code. Also, this is built on top of libxml, which simply doesn't support HTML5, although there's random patches flying about for that. But we still want to have this possible, right? So the method that we came up with doing is actually recreating a new namespace called DOM, Document Object Model. And in there, we have, for each of the HTML/XML types, we have a inherited class that implements these things. Oh, I don't want to be connected to the Wi-Fi. And then we also have classes in there that are XML document and HTML document to be able to separate out the different functionalities. Now, if you use the DOM HTML document class, then it will use the HTML5 parsing rules. We do that internally by making use of an external library that implements HTML5 parsing, not HTML4. If you don't use DOM/HTML document, just using HTML document, you're using the old way of doing that. To make things consistent, we also have DOM/XML document that also inherited from the original document class. Mainly to be consistent. But now we actually figured out that PHP's XML parsing that's been there for a long time too, is actually not following the standards 100% right. So now this gives us an opportunity to also fix that part of it as well. We can't fix that in the original DOM document class for parsing HTML because some of your code might rely on the old wrong behavior. So from PHP 8.4, we now have a nice way of parsing HTML5, but also a standards complying way of parsing XML again, which is a both useful benefit. And if you don't care about all of these things, but you still want to opt into the new behavior, you just need to replace wherever you use DOM document or, sorry, XML document or HTML document by DOM/XML document, and then it should work as a drop-in replacement. APIs are the same, behavior might differ. PHP 8.0 introduced a just-in-time compiler. A just-in-time compiler is a way for the PHP engine to compile often used PHP code instead of running it, going basically statement by statement, converting them to something that runs directly on a CPU through assembly code in some way. That speeds up your application a little bit, like 1% or 2. Useful in some situations. It is very useful in cases where you have code that runs in a very tight loop doing, say, mathematical things, like simplifying polygons would be great in there. But there are quite a few issues with this engine because every time you call a function, it needs to come out of this mode, call a PHP function, and there's quite a lot of overhead for that as well. Turning on the JIT engine is also tricky because you don't turn it on by turning it on, but by setting the memory size, which is kind of odd. Similarly, implementing the JIT engine to run on other CPUs besides your AMD 64 architecture basically required a re-implementation of everything. So that is a large effort for doing that all the time. Because we went straight from PHP code to machine code, and in our case, specifically 64-bit Intel machine code. So in PHP 8.4, we're replacing this all, or this has been replaced by a new JIT engine. You will not notice this yourself because it's a drop-in replacement. What you will notice that it might be a few percent points faster, and it will now also work on ARM and some other architectures, which is also a big benefit. It is also a lot easier to maintain because there's now an extra step in there that you can reason about. There's papers written about it with reasonable documentation, as reasonable documentation for a PHP engine goes, I suppose. And it is much easier to target for all the platforms as well. As a user, you won't notice that whatsoever. It's just a lot easier for us. It also makes it a lot easier for us to fix bugs in it. The only other thing that we've changed in JIT is how you enable it. So now normally you turn it on by setting opcache.jit to enable instead of setting the memory size to something. And we also set the memory size to the same number, 64 megabytes, because the new engine finds that a better number for some reason. Again, lots of maths involved. PHP 8.4 also gets PDO subclasses. Basically, before that, there was only PDO connect, and everything of that returned a PDO subclass. Now, for every different database driver that you had, you get a specific object, an object of a specific class back, depending on what you do. But it only works if you use PDO connect, not if you do new PDO, because again, we don't want to break people's code. One thing here, all these names are really hard to read. They follow the standard that we had in PHP, but we're changing that. So things like PDO ODBC isn't 7 capitals in a row anymore, because it's just really hard to read. So we're changing PHP's internal way of how we write class names in a different way. Again, this shouldn't impact you whatsoever, because class names are, of course, case insensitive if you forget about the autoloaders. In the future, we also want to have database-specific methods only live on these subclasses and not just on a PDO class. But that will be something that we can only do from PHP 9, because that would break code that currently exists, perhaps. Now a fun one is property hooks. So property hooks is probably, I can talk an hour about, but I only have 5 minutes left. You remember on my first slide that I had this way of setting a private property to create a read-only property. Now, of course, now we have the read-only property, the read-only keyword on properties, but it's still sometimes not always enough. It still wouldn't allow you to create like virtual properties or properties that you need to have specific validation rules on when you read from it or you write to it, right? So PHP 8.4 comes with property hooks. This is the way of, on each of the properties, you can now define a set operation and a get operation. So the get operation will be called whenever you try to read from the property. And in this case, what it will return a string concatenation of this first, a space, and this last. So this property, this full name property, isn't a property that is actually stored. It's a virtual one. And it returns data only when called. So the get line here is a single line, but you can also have multiple lines in there as well. Similarly, for setting a property, if you do a set on a virtual property, you can do some validation rules. In this case, we're splitting the name by the space, and then we can set that to each of the actual properties that we have, the first and the last name. This is a terrible way of dealing with names, by the way, but it's an example. Names are much more complicated than first name and surname, as most of you are probably aware of. Now, for each of these operations, you can have single or multiple lines. It also supports references. You can also even do this definition inside your promoted property constructors. So you can move all of this inside this line here as well. I probably wouldn't advise you do that, but you can do if you want to do that. There are lots of intricacies about these property hooks. At some point, I'm sure somebody will write a presentation or a very nice document about this that isn't the RFC that explains everything in excruciating detail. Then, that was all the features, but I also want to talk a little bit about some of the process that we changed. All the documentation for PHP, how we do this, what coding standards are, how we do a release process, they were all over the place, separated out in so many RFCs, and it was really hard to see what is the current way of doing things, because some RFCs change language or modify behavior from other policies and kind of thing. So we worked on this to create like a generic set that has the latest rules for everything. You can find that on GitHub. We haven't actually gone through them and edited the data in them yet, so it still is quite messy. But the next step is now to consolidate the information in there to make it actually a much more readable document. But that will come soon, like I just said. Also, what we're changing is the release cycle. PHP used to have 2 years of normal support and 1 year of security support. In a release process, that took a long time. We had 3 alphas, 3 betas, 3 release candidates. That's 12 releases or 24 weeks before a release. And that's such a long cycle, it's about 4 months. And those 4 months, we can't actually add new functionality to PHP, which isn't great either. There's a whole bunch of other rules that aren't really quite enforced as well. I won't tell you about the minutiae of these. And we also had that the support of say, PHP 8.2 would end exactly 3 years after the initial release. And that means it could shift, because the date when something gets released isn't always the same. So from now on, and that will come into effect from PHP 8.1, we'll have 2 years of security support instead of 1 year. We get only 4 release candidates instead of 6, and that shrinks the whole process by about a month, which means more chance of getting features in there. And also the support for language doesn't end exactly 4 years after release, but at the end of the 4th year. So that's always December 31st. So this should hopefully give a little bit more breathing space if you're concerned about not wanting to upgrade PHP, which you really should do as much as you can, but I can understand that it is sometimes always necessary. So this is now into effect from PHP 1 forwards, so that should be good and useful. And there's a graph that shows it. Pretty pictures. So yeah, that means that PHP 8.1's support will end at the end of 2025 instead of 2024. That's all I have to say. Any questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Derick. I think we have time for a question or two, max. A question there? Thank you.
Hi.
Needs syntax.
Oh, one more. Now I can hear you too.
Okay. I was saying, now that we have that needs syntax to create closures from callballs, do you think we will ever see partial function application?
That's a good question. So we had looked at it in the past before, doing partial application of function, basically where you have a closure with some of the values already filled in. It is something that we're looking at. It's a lot easier to do now, but I'm not aware of there being a current concrete proposal to do that. But it's certainly something that we are thinking of doing in a way. I don't think that will be in PHP 8.4 though, because we're getting towards the end of very long, big features to add to it. But yes, I would like to see that as well at some point.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Another one, we have time for one. In fondo, devi fare un po' di corsa.
All the way in the back, and make your some exercise.
Thank you. 2 small questions.
Yeah.
The first one, adding another year of support for a PHP version isn't scary. I mean, we all remember 5.6, and we have 5.6 right here with a lot of projects. Adding another year can slow the move from one version to another one, and adding a lot of old projects with old versions without upgrading and without forcing upgrading. The second one is...
May I answer that? Because otherwise
sure.
I will forget. So yes, there is the argument, like if you're extending security support, then people will take just another year to upgrade, right? And upgrading for 3 versions is even harder than for 2 versions to begin with. So that is true. But I think what we often find is that people that don't upgrade would never upgrade anyway. So for them, having an extra year of security support is then a good thing. That might not affect you, but I've seen that in so many cases. Agencies, for example, throw out a project and just run it and forget about it. And there's no more money of upgrading ever. So for that situation, it is useful to have. From an internal's perspective, doing an extra year of security support doesn't really cost that much because, to be fair, we don't really have many security issues to begin with. Your second question.
Yeah, it's really fast. The second question is, right now we have the array type in functions.
Yep.
But it can't specify what kind of element there are inside the array. Can we see sometimes the options to specify what kind of elements there are inside an array?
So we have, there's a prototype, there's an RFC. I wrote that last year somewhere. It works, but we put it in the fridge for a while because we're looking at implementing actual proper generics. When we have these, we wouldn't have to do that anymore. Now, that seems to be such a complicated process, generics, or adding that to the language, in such a way that we now probably will look back at these collection types that we call that. So yes, there's an RFC that is mostly written. There's a prototype that mostly works, but we haven't pushed that to be able to get it. We haven't put it up as a proposal to get it included in the language. But I think we'll soon make a decision on whether we'll try that for PHP 8.4 or not. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Derick. A big round of applause for Derick, please.
Yes.